Hello everyone, today we talk about the political and institutional evolution of the idea of kingship during the Ottonian times. Just recently I created finally a playlist dedicated exclusively to the Ottonians. There is another about medieval Germany, but this is more precise. So many of the things that I will be telling today are a bit scattered all over the other videos I made on the Ottonians, and so those can be useful as a background. But today I would like to concentrate, in fact, on this continuity, on this evolution that is very important because, as we will see, not only it had its roots fundamentally into pre-Ottonian Germany as such, and even in Carolingian times, but eventually was very important to settle certain systems fundamentally into what would have become the Holy Roman Empire, in fact, from a political and institutional point of view. So the Ottonians in this sense are often overlooked because indeed they were an empire which objectively is very difficult to call as such in many ways. The Ottonian dynasty was definitely very powerful. It was the great power of Latin Germanic Europe at the time, but its solidity as an empire was actually very rather, let's say, unstable in many ways. But nevertheless, probably the most important part is also the ideological achievements of the Ottonian dynasty. At this point, the development of the idea of the empire that paradoxically was much stronger in the sense in Ottonian times than it had been before. You know that in the history of the Holy Roman Empire, there has been this kind of especially the dynasts or at least the same imperial institutions, depending on who was controlling them, because naturally also empire had different histories, but they tended to stress the continuity. And in this sense, the continuity from the foundation of the empire since Carolingian times. This was very important because the Carolingian times had set already certain practices, certain relations. Importantly, think about the ones with the Church of Rome, but also in establishing certain rules, certain practices that were seen in following centuries as legitimated by the fact, that Charlemagne had started them. Charlemagne was considered a sort of saint at the time. He was equated to Constantine as symbol of of the empire in the West. It was a great importance attributed to what had been accomplished by these first emperors and how. But telling the truth, the empire came to develop in a very progressive way. Even the same Carolingian Empire was something that we tend to say, oh well, that was essentially the Roman Empire reborn. The Holy Roman Empire reborn. It was all set from Carolingian times. But telling the truth, this was very progressive. Aside from the name that was also in here complicated, but because for instance the term Holy Roman Empire is something that starts appearing quite late. I think in the second half of the 12th century under Frederick Barbarossa. But also the institutional continuity of what the Carolingians had done is something that it's not really to be given for granted. After all, the Carolingian Empire in fact collapsed, and it was the Ottonians that caused this, what is normally called the Renovatio Imperii, so putting together what the legacy of the Carolingians, but things could have gone otherwise. So in this video we try to observe essentially what the Ottonians did in order to restore this imperial continuity and to set it eventually also not just politically and institutionally, but also on certain territorial basis. Because at the time, for instance, it wasn't really sometimes we consider the Holy Roman Empire fundamentally as Germany and Italy and parts of, let's say, Burgundy and Bohemia, etc. But fundamentally this axis in Central Europe. But even in Ottonian times, lands like the Western Frankish Kingdom, for instance, were theoretical eligible still to be part of the empire. Even in certain maps you find that have been made later, you find, you know, northern France comprised fundamentally within the Ottonian borders, even though, you know, it's rather formal in many ways. Even later in the full Middle Ages, let's say, when we see on the map the Holy Roman Empire, in fact, we see that it maintains those borders, but theoretically, even countries like France or Spain were felt themselves as potentially part of the empire, because this was conceived still as the universal empire without any practical border that we have traced now as moderns to say, okay, this is more or less where certain prerogatives of the Holy Roman Empire were exercised in virtue of the fact that it was, I don't know, in control of Germany in part and part of Italy and those other areas, and therefore we say, okay, the authority stopped here. But theoretically, this was the universal empire. Every Christian, or at least every Western Christian at this point, still was under this empire. Then there were other regions that were completely, you know, even more extraneous to that in part, because continental Europe more or less had, you know, participated to the game. At a certain point, even England had. Think about Richard of Cornwall. He was king of the Romans at one point. But just about think Scandinavia, or you know, Eastern Catholic Europe, it never quite accepted in many ways the idea to be institutionally part of the Holy Roman Empire. So all limits that would have to be analyzed one by one, or limits in the sense of the Latin word of limit, the sense of boundary, border, whatever you want to call it, frontier, so that we will maybe do it another time. Today we stick to what the Ottonians actually accomplished into that part. So first of all, as we know, the kingdom of the Eastern Franks was commonly defined in post-Carolingian age as the Teutonic Kingdom. This was essentially a name that came from the ancient Teutonists that were, you know, they were used as a synecdoche fundamentally to define at this point to the whole Germans. This idea of a properly German identity did not really exist yet. It was being formed actually still in the same Carolingian times, and eventually, especially in Ottonian times, it was reinforced for it. But it was fundamentally emanated by certain centers of monastic centers, fundamentally of high intellectual development, that like Reichenau or other St. Gallen that we're starting to use this term fundamentally to define the kingdom of the Eastern Franks as if it was a sort of natio in the Latin term of war. But this is also not really quite such, because I don't know whether in these sources they consider still the various nationes that made part of the Eastern Frankish kingdom. But nevertheless, they were starting to structure fundamentally a common idea of common belonging. It was mostly political at that time, because it had to do, in fact, with the partition, with the kingdom that had been had emerged from the partition of the Carolingian Empire. Was in fact the one of the Eastern Franks, or the Teutonic one now. So also another episode that people say, well, the Carolingian Empire finished in 888 because Charles the Fat dies. There are no Carolingian heirs anymore. It's as if, you know, the institution of the empire finished in itself. It didn't finish at all. It was, as a matter of fact, the concept of empire was not the modern one we have of an empire with borders, with a time. This is always remembered. This is the universal empire, and the concept of imperium was still pretty much felt, and I suspect especially still into the especially among the Germans, this northern, you know, this fundamentally this Central European area, as the actual ability of command, the power of command, because the Byzantines at that point were already well framed from a legalistic point of view. They had framed the Roman Empire as a real thing. It was the Roman Empire, the Eastern Roman Empire was properly a state. In the West, it was concretely nothing like that, and the way the same Carolingians and later the Ottonians were stressing their imperial prerogatives was on, and their legitimacy was essentially on the, if you want, in the actual original sense of the empire, that is the authority of those of the military commander, fundamentally, of those who had the military power to extend their control over a certain area to rule over it, fundamentally. So it was also very mystical as a concept in many ways, and this was continuing, because even though the imperial authority was not renewed actually anymore on the former Carolingian borders, because historically speaking this wasn't done, just maybe Napoleon as protector Confederacy of the Rhine, but he actually abolished the Holy Roman Empire. But from there on, the Saxons basically just reattached Italy to the Kingdom of Germany and connected these two areas of Europe for the centuries to come. But also in here, nobody actually managed to restore the boundaries of the ancient Carolingian Empire. But this is the point, that they weren't theoretically not even recognized at a certain point. The same Carolingian rule had been not really superficial as such, but let's say not really sanctioned, if not by the sheer military power, the dimensions, let's say, that the mere military deterrence could stand themselves in. So in 887 there was essentially a continuity in the empire in many ways. The greats of the kingdom fundamentally elected as king of the Eastern Frankish Kingdom a member of the Carolingian dynasty, that was Arnulfo of Carinthia. Arnulfo of Carinthia was essentially the legitimate son of Carloman of Bavaria, who was the eldest son of Louis the German, king of East Francia, fundamentally, who basically overthrew his uncle Charles the Fat, or known as Charles the Third, was basically the last ruler of the Carolingian Empire proper. At least it's usually defined like this. At this point, he had been basically disconfessed by the various vassals who fled to Arnulfo of Carinthia, knowing that he had in fact been elected, and abandoned him, so depriving him of power. The Carolingian world was still the idea that the sovereign had to be fit in many ways to be to rule practically. So even the idea of calling up in arms, you can see even from these pictures that I'm using in the background, all the various from the various seals of especially this first pre-Ottonian kings, how strong was the military connotation of these kings, with a shield and a spear, typical Germanic weapons. The idea that these kings had to be warriors fundamentally, and still being able to in fact wage war through the imperium proper. Excuse me, I drink a little bit. So excuse me. So now the history of Arnulf is you can't substantially. He intervened. What can we can tell something about him very briefly. This is not the point. Arnulf substantially had become Duke of Carinthia in 880, and as we've seen 70 years later, he was elected by the Greats of Germany after the deposition of Charles the Fat, his uncle, that was provoked by him, in fact. He was actually famous for certain military expeditions. He defeated the Vikings at Leuven, I believe it's called, or Louvain, I know the French pronunciation, just in 881, so hence repelling them from Germany, although he couldn't stop already at this time the raids of the Hungars that had, he actually also had kind of engaged and had become allies, excuse me. Oh my. Had engaged them substantially. Excuse me, but in spring I get this sneeze all the time. His allies had been his allies in 892 against Moravia, fundamentally, and his authority was extended to his beyond his local heritage, let's say in southern Germany, also to the to Bavaria, to Swabia and Franconia. So this area fundamentally of southern central Germany as a whole, where he was the core of his domains. He was called also in 894 by the Pope because Papacy was being threatened by at least that same Pope was also famously Pope Formosus, if I'm not wrong. Yeah, that is the one who had the famous trial. He was unburied. First of all, he was slaughtered, and then he, if I'm not wrong, actually, he excuse me, a lot. No, he wasn't slaughtered. He was just unburied, and basically there was a trial carried out against him as a skeleton, fundamentally, even with the witness that had to speak for him behind the chair. It's pretty weird, but basically in life, Formosus had been threatened by Guy of Spoleto, who was also an enemy of let's say this was the main mover. He Arnulfo crossed the Alps. He devastated also all around. So this, you have to imagine also the strategical dimensions were pretty much short-lived at this point, because the Carolingian Empire had collapsed. So these kings were fundamentally just taking all they could take at the moment and not caring pretty much for the rest of the unity, because they simply didn't have the resources to put everything together. So maybe raiding was still an option. So the Italic feudatories kind of didn't like him at all, rightfully for this reason, and this brought him back to Germany. The year after, however, he marched once again against Lambert, who was the son of Guy, and also against Berengarius. And he is the of Friuli, and his reign. So he also actually managed to reach Rome and to take it by storm, and he was crowned emperor finally in there on February the 22nd, 896. So he kind of tried to maintain this continuity, as we've seen in Carolingian times, but this his reign fundamentally marked his definitive detachment of Germany from the body of what had been conceived up to that point of the Frankish Empire. Although he set this this kind of precedence fundamentally for the expedition into Italy at this time. Once again, the precedence to the essentially the intrusion of the Kingdom of Germany into the matters of the peninsula. So you see that more or less this had happened also before, with the same, who had to seize the imperial crown, where the Carolingian branch of the Teutonic Kingdom had died out. So also in there, the Charles the Bald, and even in fact the same, was it the same Arnulfo who went in there? Actually, I don't remember, but it was the son of Louis the German, if I'm not wrong, was too old to go to war. But basically, these two, the Western Frankish and Eastern Frankish armies, met into northern Italy. They didn't fight; they just agreed on the, on how the matter had to be shared, because Charles the Bald had obtained now an imperial crown, but had not already enough power from Western Francia to control directly the Italic kingdom. So a lot of a big mess in a situation where everything was literally tearing itself apart. Also, Charles had many problems with the nobility of Western Francia. Certain trends that also in the Western Frankish kingdom would become chronic were already happening there at the end of the 9th century. So a moment, however, of contraction. So even these precedents didn't bring to anything stable for a long time to come, up to the Ottonians. And Arnulf also, let me check if there was something else to say, but I don't think so. However, he died in 899, and at this point he was succeeded by his son Louis the Younger, who in my opinion would have been a very he was a very promising king actually, but he's known as in this way because in fact he died when he was still a teenager. He was in fact the son of Arnulf. He was born in 883, and when he was only 7 in the year 900, he was actually raised to the throne of Germany at the Diet of Forchheim, especially with through the support, thanks to the support excuse me, of the great clergy, of the high clergy of Germany. And at this point he, because his father had died in 899, so he governed under a council of regency at one point, in which initially it was the Archbishop of Mainz, Otto, that had the lead. And this, as you can imagine, was a very tormented kingdom, because it was actually troubled by the clash, the wars, the conflicts between the great lords of Germany, especially the greatest clashes were the ones between the lords of Franconia, the Adalbert who came from Bamberg, and the so-called Conradins of Salients that were Rudolf and Conrad. Eventually Conrad was elected as King of Germany, as we will see, and this was also the moment in which Germany was hit pretty hard by the say the so-called second invasions. Although the situation was a bit more varied, the borders of the Kingdom of Germany were kind of very fluid in many ways. So the Danes, the Sorbs, the Moravians, and even the Angers were, and especially the Angers, were hitting hard into the depth of the kingdom, and in especially the Angers between 906 and 910 penetrated into up to Saxony, massacring, devastating. Also in Bavaria, it was naturally closer. Bavaria was in particular obliged to pay a tribute but they raided as far as Thuringia, as Swabia and Franconia. So Swabia and Franconia. So the, the obviously the Louis was, or Ludwig, depending how you want to call him, was not powerful enough, as being still a minor, and there was no other way at that point to react to this situation but delegating the local the local communities to carry out by themselves their own defense, and this naturally increased the power of the local lords that were put in charge of the military territorial military forces, essentially. And this is the moment in which it was, or at least reinforced, the idea of the duchies. The idea that these chunks of the Eastern Frankish kingdom were ruled by dukes, so duches. This which reveals the quite markedly military nature of this office. So the kingdom of Louis the Younger was fundamentally a moment of decentralization that set a little bit, or at least increased and accelerated the decentralized institutional aspect was of Germany. And Louis died when he was only 16, if I'm not wrong, or 17, I don't remember, on September the 24th, 911, in Augsburg, and he was eventually buried in Regensburg. So with Louis the Younger, fundamentally the Carolingian branch of Germany extinguished definitively, and this is fundamentally the very last. With Charles III, you have basically the end of the unity of the empire that he had also quite miraculously put together because all the other Carolingian relatives had died. Now the last branch of the Carolingians died out with the Carinthian branch and with Louis the Younger. And as we were saying, was at this point mostly the the most important aristocratic families that were of Germany that were pushing fundamentally to and compete with each other for the obtaining the lead of the kingdom. And at this point they were also in fact strengthening at a local level their own power fundamentally. It was relatively easy, not existing essentially a central authority that could control them. They were expanding with political and military means their domains, actually seizing and especially in this sense usurping, if you want, the public rights, the public prerogatives. It means all the money that had to be paid to the public authority that had formerly existed during the Carolingian Kingdom, and now they were essentially seizing for themselves. On Schwerpunkt we have been talking frequently about how this process actually occurred everywhere in post-Carolingian Europe, how this process was kind of mediated also by the same public authority in many ways. This was especially typical of Western Francia in many ways, but it happened really everywhere. It happened in Germany, it happened in Italy. In Germany, however, the situation was a bit different since the very beginning, because what really characterized the Teutonic Kingdom was since the beginning was the presence of these wide regional duchies. They were essentially predating as let's say certain political entities the the Carolingian domination. So we're talking chiefly about the duchies of Bavaria, of Swabia, and of Saxony, and of other, instead, more strictly Carolingian environments that stem from certain political and administrative repartitions of the empire, such as the duchies of Lotharingia, or Lotharingia if you want, and Franconia, that were controlled by, however, in general, were by families that had managed at that point to render as kind of dynastic their own ducal title and the annexed public functions. So even though these duchies maintained a name, a denomination that referred to this ancient ethnical or administrative realities, the duchies were instead a sort of autonomous kingdoms on their own. The King of Germany, in this sense, was elected, in fact, in virtue of the grades of the kingdom, and always kind of belonged to these ducal lineages. And in fact, the same public authority into the Kingdom of Germany was becoming fundamentally as a sort of symbolical entity. Had a kind of symbolical role as well, of both of supreme judge and of military leader. These were theoretically the two major functions: justice and the means to enforce justice. Fundamentally, this was there was a great continuity, locally speaking, in the Eastern Frankish Kingdom with the ancient Germanic traditions. In many ways, the Eastern Germanic Kingdom was fundamentally, the Eastern Frankish Kingdom was fundamentally a Germanic entity, as we've seen. In language, in culture, in traditions, these peoples had been kind of always different since the beginning. The conquest of Germany at the hands of the Carolingians was quite complex, as you can remember. I believe fundamentally certain parts of Germany were, first of all, part of Francia proper. The Franks had come from Germany, but we're talking just about roughly the northwestern regions. The ones the Franks came from the Weser, the upper Weser area, the forests came from there, and Austrasia was the eastern part of the original Francia, was fundamentally this area comprehended between, looking at a map, the easternmost part was the Scheldt River. Fundamentally, the west, I think the border arrived to. Let's give a look to it more precisely. Well, actually, it arrived far west from what can. It arrived fundamentally, yeah, up to Tertry. It comprehended Metz, so actually pretty far west, more west than we can imagine. But also, Austrasia had developed fundamentally, particularly eastwards into central Germany proper, in that area that would be known, in fact, as Franconia later. That was following the Mainz, the Main River from Mainz. Think about Fulda. So these centers that had stretched up to, actually, and crossed Germany almost up to the Slavic lands of the Sorbs and the Czechs. So that had been an important appendix. Naturally, was following the Main River, so there was this route of communication that also for the traffics was important. It had contributed also partly to split northern and southern Germany, also because these were originally Thuringian lands. Thuringia survived, let's say, in its easternmost part. There was also kind of annexed formally to the kingdom, but since the 6th century, the Thuringians had remained, but these were areas where the Franks only controlled, vaguely. The bulk of Frankish power was essentially in the west. So in the north you had Saxony, that remained fundamentally independent up to the conquest of Charlemagne between the end of the 8th and the beginning of the 9th century, to remain definitely incorporated, and being actually the last German land to be incorporated into the Frankish territory. Germany, in this sense, if there was, it's improper to talk about it in the first place, but Germany kind of stopped to the Elbe River in part, and not even actually, because just in the Saxon part it ended there, because eventually the Elbe continued in far east, and if you go down, it was still before the Elbe, going from Germany to the east, there were the Sorbs and the Czechs. So this is but the areas of southern Germany at this point, like Swabia, Bavaria, etc., were fundamentally maintained under the Carolingian domination, and had already, since the Merovingian times, kind of partly absorbed into this broader Frankish orbit. And it was actually the easternmost part of the Eastern Frankish Kingdom, that was Carinthia, that partly comprehended these areas of today's southeastern, essentially today's Austria fundamentally, and even parts of northeastern Italy that had become also quite militarized area because were area of frontier. So there were these big chunks fundamentally of populations that, take Swabia for instance, would be the land of the Alemanni part. These were lands that surely were not Alemannic anymore. They had the Alemanni also had their own tough. These were lands that had been conquered by the Franks since the 6th century, and where the Franks had sent, in fact, their own Frankish counts, etc., and the aristocracies had mingled eventually into the at the end of the 8th century. Also, it was a major slaughter of the Alemannic nobles, so there had been a lot of replacement. Therefore, reason for which by this at this point, by these post-Carolingian times, the result of all of these interactions was fundamentally an hybrid between the Frankish world, essentially this Germanic, Gallo-Roman world, and this more strictly Germanic area of the east, where the ancient ethnic duchies, or whatever they were called actually, were still standing fundamentally, but were practically not corresponding anymore to the strictly ethnic repartitions. The people who ruled, the dynasties, the ducal dynasties who ruled over these lands, were naturally stressing the ethnic continuity at a local base, but it was completely ideological in many ways. Surely there were certain feelings, central ideas of belonging, of traditional practices, especially from a juridical point of view. The Carolingian Empire was multi-ethnic in the sense, especially from a juridical point of view, could be that was really the ethnic discriminant under which law you were judged. Practically, you could even swap it. You could choose it at a point. So it's obvious that, I don't know, say in Swabia, now that we made this example, there was a certain tongue, a certain identity locally that was, surely different from Austrasia, from Thuringia, from Bavaria, from Saxony, but the ethnical continuity of the Alemanni, of the Swabians, or whatever you want to call them, was non-existent, especially in this moment where practically there was a brutal acceleration towards the creation of leading aristocratic lineages that were taking over also the prerogatives of the freemen through the vassalatic beneficiary system. So a perfect hybrid actually, that was also very convenient for these lineages to form something, to carve, let's say, their own power in there. And by the way, these duchies were not also acting in a quite unitary way. There were naturally within the same duchies many contrasts, many rivalries, and the great lords were essentially all competing one against the other. However, consider also that Germany at this time was still not very much different from, say, Roman times. It was full of forests, of swamps. The Franks had carried out some form of colonization. They had reclaimed certain lands that they had deforested, but largely it was also pretty tough ground where actually these duchies had formed, first of all, because of natural barriers, natural borders. You know, the great terrain, these great forests in Germany had definitely that would always remain important, especially in the High Middle Ages, also for the economy, etc. That had, however, had brought to the division of this kind of ethnic chunks of the region. And consider that up to, in fact, up to the creation of the Eastern Frankish Kingdom, so this repartition was carried out by the Carolingians, these lands had never been under a common rule. Today we look at Germany and we know, oh yeah, that was roughly Germany, but Germany didn't exist at the time, you know, as such. I mean, obviously the continental, it's always difficult to talk about this because it always goes by approximation. There was a great Germanic area into Europe at that point, and you couldn't. It's really difficult to tell, you know, this as are the big chunks. Yeah, you can say that the Scandinavians were kind of a bit more on their own. You can definitely stress the fact that the Anglo-Saxons, only for living into an island, were kind of on their own. That the continental Germans were also relatively similar, but if you really look at them and their differences and the way they looked at themselves and how they perceived themselves, were actually very probably more locally minded, and that their horizons were actually pretty short in many ways. I mean, they surely were larger this time in the measure in which they participated to the events of the empire than of the kingdom, now that the empire was basically vanished. But they still were rooted on their own, let's say, provincial scale. They didn't look much beyond in terms of actual capability of rule. Even if you look at the Ottonians, they started to build their empire essentially seeking for alliances and relations with the other dynasties of Germany. The fortune of the Ottonian Empire was obtained through fundamentally the conjunction of the junction of Saxony and of Franconia in many ways, but also in there it was very problematic to keep everything together. Excuse me, I drink a little once again. So this was a moment of experimentation of new in the building of new domains that were finally now unconstrained by a superior authority and could enlarge on a local base step by step, but eventually building up certain entities and realities that in the following centuries would have grown to be something more substantial. If you think about it, like, yeah, especially entities like Bavaria, Swabia, and Saxony, that interestingly enough were kind of the part of the more ancient repartitions. They were not really of Carolingian, of Frankish creation. For instance, Lotharingia and Franconia were not growing to be something particularly consistent. Yeah, okay, well, the Salians actually stemmed from there, so Franconia also had this importance. But for instance, Lotharingia was something that went completely fragmented. So if you look at it in perspective, it's as if, however, those high medieval German political entities that had a kind of a greater fortune were, before the fragmentation in post-Hohenstaufen times, were fundamentally based on this ancient ethnic duchies. So the king in all this was just depending practically on the grades of the kingdom. That's why the crown of Germany was characterized by an elective nature, an elective functioning. This is important because that's objectively how the system. It's not that other kingdoms work quite differently, because theoretically, in the political practice of the Latin Germanic West at this point, all kings had to be theoretically elected. I mean, even naturally also in the Western Frankish Kingdom and in the Italic Kingdom, this was kind of the case. Even the same imperial title was formally conferred not just by the Pope, but also by the Roman people. I mean, in all these, ceremonies that of crowning, of imperial crowning in Rome, theoretically the Roman people as such, so as this ancient Indo-European entity in theory that had to elect the kings, what was required to. Naturally, yeah, lots of a lot of water had passed under the bridges. It's not that the Romans were considering in Rome themselves as an ethnic, entity that were essentially the Roman people at this time were the Roman aristocrats of the city. But that was the ancient idea: is that leaders had to be elected. It was the old, say, pan-Indo-European thing that the imperator had to be conferred in part. Yes, of course, by the gods, but by essentially through the social pact of the freemen that accepted this, his own power. So this was really the case. Even if you look at how eventually at the end of the 10th century the Capetians were put in charge of the Western Frankish affairs and emerging as the dynasty par excellence in the French kingdom later in the High Middle Ages. They were still elected. Everything was elective because that was the Germanic political practice that couldn't be, ignored. So Germany, in this sense, was not truly an exception from an institutional point of view. On the contrary, it was the normality. The only big difference, the characteristic trait, is that in Germany, this elective system was practically backed, fueled, and reinforced by probably this pre-existing situation that had never seen a common ruler over those lands. I mean, Western Francia had the Frankish Kingdom that was dominated in Lower France, and these other peoples scattered around in Merovingian and Carolingian times. The Kingdom of Italy was the ancient Longobarд Kingdom, where there was one king that effectively ruled over the other dukes, and then eventually was inherited as such an institutional system by the same Carolingians. Germany didn't have anything like that. Germany had all these scattered different populations that were surely, had something in common, relatively vaguely in tongue, in ethnicity, but had never considered themselves as something unitary at all. And they were keeping not considering them as such. Because if eventually, into German history, the feudal system at a certain point, even with great difficulties, kind of started. And there was a point in which the German rulers tried to create something like a national monarchy. Obviously, it failed. It failed for many reasons, chiefly the fact that the Germanic sovereigns were pursuing this dream of the universal empire, of the Mediterranean empire. They basically spent all their resources out of Germany, because otherwise they could have achieved the construction of a national monarchy, just like in France or in England at that point. But let's say at that point it was feasible. There was the idea that a common institution kind of existed and could theoretically take over. The Holy Roman Empire, later called, in fact, in this moment of greater fragmentation after the Hohenstaufen had tried to condensate of the Holy Roman Empire, the Germanic nation, was created with the intention of, however, having a common aim, a common rule. Germany, for instance, if you think about it, was a weak area. But unlike Italy, for instance, it was kind of the same. It was never conquered de facto by other by foreign entities. Naturally, Italy was much more, was much more desirable prey. Also in there was not actually not so easy to control everything, but more or less there could be a good cooptation of the local elites and everything could function. But Germany kind of remained this labyrinth and difficult area to enter in, fundamentally speaking. So nobody quite. There are many reasons. Now we can't speak in detail about this because the video otherwise gets incredibly long. But just for saying that at this point in the 10th century, not only obviously the noblemen wanted to do what the hell they wanted, but they also had never had a common management of they never had a common kingdom to participate to. So what they wanted practically was not even to secede from the empire, because there was nothing like that, but just because they understood that that could be profitable. But they just wanted, however, to limit as much as they could the royal authority and just to tie it to their own will. Hence, the elective nature was much stronger in there, because without the support of these feudatories, the king had no other pre-existing central structure that could allow him to rule over this land. So this opens to, so the idea of the military leader also was and of supreme judge was quite important to the Germanic world. It partly corresponded to these pre-existing traditions that the Germans had also before the Carolingian times. Therefore, the Germans, or whatever you want to call the inhabitants of the Eastern Frankish Kingdom, were fundamentally they agreed, and naturally they were aware of the advantages that a monarchy represented. After Carolingian times, these duchies didn't say, oh well, once we were not under Carolingian rule, let's break apart the empire, let's not make it. No, of course not. They understood perfectly that this was an incredible opportunity for them to basically influence a much larger system, trying to get benefits, individual benefits through this mechanism. So a military leader was very important when it came, obviously, to in times of war, and these were times of war, as we've seen. The enemy, the Vikings, the Slavs, and the Hungars especially were ravaging the kingdom. So this is, for instance, one of the greater factors that contributed also to the rise of the Ottonians into Germany, because if Germany had been, relatively peaceful at the time, nobody would have really entrusted much power to a single a king or single ruler to for no reason. At this time, instead, times of war required this duchies also to stick together, to have a common organization, a collective organization, and to give some resources to a military leader that would had to be effective in order to repel these devastating invasions that were damaging all the duchies in a way or in another. That naturally, yeah, there were, you know, backstabbings all the time. These German duchies kind of all betrayed each other as soon as they could. But that was an important factor. You know, there was a pressure was posed by that. I mean, this happened also in other areas of Europe at the time. In England, in France, and in Italy at this time, there was a very strong, I mean, very strong for the time, of course, push for, you know, for a common effort, and to maintain fundamentally a unity. It seems that, for instance, as devastating as the Viking raids could be, really the Western Frankish kingdom benefited from that as a monarchy, because if there hadn't been Viking raids, nobody would have looked at the king to do something about it, and this would have decreased his authority. Even the Teutonic Kingdom, this was arguably, you know, the one that, for certain reasons, also the way it was, you know, structured geographically speaking, had perhaps the weakest monarchic authority at this time, was able to put up a joint effort, for instance, for expelling the Saracens from the mouth of the Garigliano River. There was, in this terrible moment, you know, that we described as a terrible moment of fragmentation, actually a public authority was working in all of these post-Carolingian lands, and even in lands like the Anglo-Saxon kingdom. The monarchy was strengthened by the Viking raids, because there had to be a joint reaction. So war is, as many times in history, a great strengthener of political and military authority, not necessarily for the best of the, say, of the rights of the people who lived in there, because this went along, for instance, with the spread of feudalism and with the impoverishment of the freeman class. This was particularly even in Germany, where at a certain point there had also been the Stellinger revolt that had brought the freemen to ally with the slaves, with the serfs. That is something absurd, especially from a market from the traditional Germanic perspective, because they had understood that the aristocracy that the Franks had introduced into their lands wanted to take over everything and to reduce the freemen essentially at the rank of serfs in practice. This is what was happening this time. So you realize economical crisis, war, political fragmentation, all this brought also to the society to impoverish, and even those who were at the top were saying, okay, maybe I'll take this as an opportunity to expand my authority over the local communities and so on, but at the same time we have to do something about this, because otherwise we will simply end up destroyed by some hunger, by other political concurrence. So this was a factor that really put together the premises for a kind of a monarchical rebirth into Germany. There have been, now these are topics that are partly difficult to discuss because there's been a huge historiographical debate around this, and there is still, fortunately. Naturally, there were certain nationalist interpretations of this history that naturally we are looking past behind, because they were mostly a product of 19th century historiography that saw in the Teutonic Kingdom of the 10th century as a sort of a politically and ethnic cohesive and compact entity, which is completely absurd. Those who supported this thesis, so especially in the election royal election of Conrad I of Franconia that had happened in 911, the date of birth of Germany, because theoretically this through this act, for the first time, all the German lineages had decided to put themselves under the guidance of a single king. But much more correct is to see in the very contradictory events that preceding the 11th century the intertwinement of very different political projects that from one side wanted, of course, to give unity to the different duchies, but from the other hand they were still corresponding to local interests, and they were fueled actually by a very high competition between the other that actually shows the uncommon aims. And naturally, however, in all of this, there was a structuring of the imperial ideology as well, because it's exactly because of the lack of a powerful central authority that and this fragmentation and the impossibility of extending a long-term rule over wide areas of this region, that all the various powers were trying to to strengthen their power, even being elected as kings or emperors, were trying to stress, in fact, the necessity of this to happen, therefore stressing the legitimacy of the imperial authority and its role. And this is particularly evident if we look at what happened after Conrad I. We can actually spend a few words about Conrad I as well. That is kind of a forgotten figure in part. He had been, in fact, he was Duchy of, he was Duke of Franconia. He died in 918. He succeeded in 906 to his father, that was Conrad, Count of Langau, and he also was married into the Carolingians. Initially, all these dynasties had more or less certain ties with the Carolingians. They had, or at least they, especially at this in the higher aristocracies, naturally had sought to form certain bonds with the royal family, and vice versa, by the way, because that was a good way to control also locally from the Carolingians at the beginning. And he was eventually elected, as we've seen, after the death of Louis the Younger, king of the Eastern Franks at Forchheim in 911. At this point, he sought the support of the church that traditionally had been kind of, in fact, had backed fundamentally the royal authority because it had something to gain, but always not excessively. In fact, not even with support of the church, Conrad managed to rise and to affirm himself over the other duchies, over the other dukes. But he, on the contrary, he was adverse basically by almost all of them. So this unity under Conrad I seems rather fantastic in many ways. And there were very harsh conflicts at this time. I mean, war was quite endemic at this point. The greatest opponent of Conrad was the Lotharingia, and Conrad famously also died fighting against the Hungars, that at this point had come to even to attack and to set to burn down Basel, today's Switzerland. And before dying, however, he had designated as his successor one of his major opponents at the beginning, that was Henry, Duke of Saxony, then eventually also known as Henry I. We're talking about Henry the Fowler, and this is how basically the Ottonians rose to the top. This succession had been contrasted. Now the reasons why this had happened are kind of complicated to explain, but Henry I was finally elected as Henry the Fowler was finally elected as Henry I of Germany, and he is a very important figure in German history, because he has been attributed also as the kind of a founder of in part of or at least he allowed the same rise of eventually his son Otto I to the recreation of the empire, fundamentally. He was Henry I was son of Otto the Illustrious, so-called Duke of Saxony. He had become Duke of Saxony in 912. He had initially fought against Conrad I, King of Germany, as we've seen, and he was elected in 919 as king. So he managed. The Saxons were pretty at this time. The Duchy of Saxony was rising through these clashes. The Saxons had not lost their warlike nature, not even under Carolingian domination. The dynasties that were ruling over this area were substantially pretty much forged into battle in many ways. So Henry managed basically to the dukes Burkhard of Swabia and Arnulfo of Bavaria to bow to him. He managed also to extend some control on Lotharingia, and he that was this area that was substantially battle over between the Western and by the Western and Eastern Frankish kings, and he famously fought against the Hungars that were invading Germany, and he managed, however, to conclude a truce of 9 years from 924, also fundamentally paying a tribute to them. But this, however, allowed Germany to breathe once again. Henry managed to strengthen the defense on the Elbe River against the Slavs and also towards Bohemia, and in 933 he managed to fight and defeat the Hungars, famously at the Battle of Riade, slaughtering them. And this was the major victory, actually much more important than the one of his son Otto I on Lechfeld in 955, that was magnified by the Ottonian historiography. It really, most of the job had been done by his father and also by the Bavarians, that are often the unsung victors of the Hungars, that were, by the way, just next to them. Also geographically speaking, they defeated them several times, a couple of times. However, that was enough to sensibly shatter their power. Then eventually Otto I took up this legacy and finally defeated them at the Lech. Henry also fought successfully against the Slavs and the Danes in 934, and before dying he designated as his own successor and heir his son Otto. So also Henry has been represented by the nationalistic historiography as the father of Germany. And he also was sometimes conceived as the symbol of a supposed posthumous vendetta of the Saxons, the people that had been massacred by the Franks, but that nevertheless, not even after 1 century of his own subjugation, had managed with Henry theoretically the lead of all over Germany. This is obviously a kind of a misleading interpretation that was using certain political categories that were completely stranger to the 10th century. The Ottonians had risen to power to this very into this century by these various opportunities that formed political ability, military power, and other factors that ultimately also escaped their own control. The Ottonians were not properly also in here necessarily Saxons. There was already kind of a dynastic mindset that was taking over. The Ottonians actually descended from the same Widukind that had rebelled to Charlemagne from I think I don't remember exactly the genealogy, but I think from Otto's mother they descended from there. While the counts, the dukes of Saxony, as the family of the Ottonians from Henry the Fowler had descended from an unknown Carolingian count that had been set into Saxony, of whom we neither know the name. So this was actually, this obscure genealogy was even kind of a problem for the Ottonians later, because they didn't have basically any famous ancestor. So now when they came to revive the empire, they were pretty embarrassed, because the most famous figure they could find in their genealogy was Widukind, that had been the leader of the Saxon revolt against the Carolingians. So it's kind of against the empire in many ways. So nevertheless, this shows you, well, aside from the problems of the Ottonians, we're all aware of family problems, that there was a very strong hybrid now between the Carolingian and the Frankish element and the Saxon one, so that we can't talk about something properly Saxon as such, but the things had pretty much blended in. And even as we were saying before, the bulk of on a greater scale, the bulk of Ottonian power mostly stemmed from Saxony and Franconia. So basically the Saxons, the Ottonians managed to put together and to reinforce also ideologically this, they managed to stress the union of the military nature of the Saxons, so this fierce warlike character that the Saxons were kind of famous for, and the imperial grandeur of the Franks through Franconia. So the bond between these two regions of Germany was very important, because it kind of symbolized overall the perfect fusion that had occurred between the Franks and the Carolingians, and the Saxons at a broader level. And other interpretations that have been given naturally are also relative to the fact that Henry managed to defeat the Hunger raids. This has been interpreted as well by the nationalist historiography as the first example of sort of mission of the German people to that is essentially the Germanization of Eastern Europe. That is also naturally a myth. At this point, definitely the Ottonians tried to secure the eastern borders and even to expand with arms against the Slavs across the Elbe. They had this influence on Bohemia. The Ottonians were pushing towards that direction. This is something that the nationalist historiography also stressed in later times. For later times, like the Swabian period, where the Swabians were basically fighting over Italy, so kind of growing relatively forgetful, in their opinion, of the German affairs, while Henry the Lion was proceeding with the expansion towards the east and the Baltic as a truer German, direction fundamentally. So these are kind of very disturbing ideas today, but at the time the Ottonians had naturally mostly the need of securing the frontiers, of avoiding especially that the raids could hit hard the core regions of the empire. It's a bit like what the Carolingians had done against the Saxons, so expanding to the east but over other Germans actually. So the problem with the Saxons is not that Saxony was such a desirable place to conquer, but the problem is that there were raids were continuously launched from there into the Rhine Valley, and the Franks needed that area to be pacified for production, for agriculture chiefly. So these raids could be really devastating, and that's the reason why they expanded their borders. So this is basically what the Ottonians do in turn, always towards the east, because the west was kind of more, say, was not necessarily less dangerous, but it was at least more controllable. There were common, political culture, administrative practices, and so on. So that they kind of understood each other. Far in the east was this other, fundamentally still tribesmen, that also based their own economy in turn on raids. It's not the word raiding because they were intrinsically, bad people. they were raiding because east of the Elbe, it's not that the economy was pretty much, you couldn't really afford to grow more than much without raids, without essentially going pillage and to loot other people's resources. So this is a bit like what the Hungars were doing at the same time. So naturally, also the Ottonian dynasty started in many ways, but also the Carolingians had done it in part. But the Ottonians now were essentially starting it from Germany proper to expanding it in the surrounding areas, especially in the east. This process of pacification and sedentarization of the peoples that gravitated around. If you look at the history of these kingdoms, of Hungary, of Bohemia, of Poland, these were all kingdoms that were basically incorporated into the Western and Germanic and also Christian, Roman fundamentally orbit, and that gave themselves an order that they were essentially imitating from the West, because they also understood, especially their elites naturally understood, that the feudal system, that the vassalic beneficiary system, let's say better, was being developed into the Germanic world, was kind of, in Western Europe, was kind of effective. They wanted, obviously, as kings, as aristocrats, to implement their rights, their prerogatives, to come to rule over a larger domain, to structure it, to absorb certain communities and to control them. So this is paradoxical because, but not so much, because we often stress the political fragmentation and decentralization that feudalism represents, but if you look at it in perspective, the vassalic beneficiary system was proposing a model was much more centralized than others that existed out there. So that tribalism was, in part surpassed by this. And this happened also not just for the Slavs or this Eastern Kingdom in general, but also for the Scandinavians, for instance. At this time, Denmark was pretty much influenced by Carolingian and Ottonian culture, because they were trying fundamentally to center to centralize, to concentrate the power in the hands of a unique ruler. Naturally, with great distress of all the people who didn't want this in those countries. So this was a very slow process. And that took so much time. In fact, in the same lands that were more or less already Francicized, and even more, in fact, in those who weren't. But nevertheless, the empire was setting a model also for other people. So the mere expansion towards the east now had yet to come, and also in there was something very contingental and dictated by dynamics that had nothing to do with the ideology of the Germans expanding, conquering the east just for the sake of it. And there were certain opportunities to exploit, fundamentally, and the capacity of projection of certain powers into certain other systems that were fragmented enough to be, to be influenced, to be controlled in part, and the benefit of the entity that was exercising that power. So, however, and this is also partly the reason why such interpretations had a relative fortune at the time, is that the same Ottonians now began to structure their own imperial ideology. It was since fundamentally the end of the 10th century that the Ottonians were stressing this new model of royalty, starting chiefly from Henry I. I mean, the Ottonians were really trying to ennoble their own family in this sense, which reveals by the dynastic mindset that is people's had. You can't say it was a matter of the Saxons as such. There was definitely still the in these stories, in these chronicles, the idea that of course it was the Saxons originally, but it the leader emerges, and that's the leader who does everything and basically takes the merit for having conquered this and subjugated that, and having created an empire that in this sense owes much to the individual and not to. And there were definitely also in Germanic culture, this kind of ideas. The military leader had always been kind of a praised figure in there. The only difference is now that this was happening. It was not happening to the tribal environment where the military leader was elected just for the seasonal raid over the enemies. Now, these were powerful families with castles, with land, with that were actually building that up, physically speaking, generation by generation, and therefore were coming to rule over a very different society, and were essentially centralizing everything, collecting everything in their hands as much as they could, with great difficulty. But at the same time, this difficulty was triggered by other dynasties, so not really other people in general, but really dynasts. The 10th century is perhaps the most important century for the creation of a common I would say class consciousness of the seigneurial lords. I mean, I mean, of the seigneurial, you know, of the lords in general into Europe, also in terms of knighthood, etc. So the idea of noble blood, of lineage, of that corresponded now to this, also to this, the exercise of the profession of arms through, you know, the idea that now there was a knight who could fight, because there were lots of other people, see, peasants, that were working to produce his equipment, to maintain him and his military retinues and so on. So a society that was going towards a very aristocratic direction was accelerated into that process. A great contribution to the strengthening of the imperial ideology came also from certain literates of court. I think I made a video, but I don't remember which one it was actually, where, if you let me search for it, which I discuss fundamentally the construction. I remember there was. Let me see if I can find it. It was essentially on the construction of the imperial ideology in. It might be literary production in early medieval Europe. Like at the end of the video, I discuss, I think, about Widukind of Corvey and how the Ottonians gave essentially a boost to, especially in the full Ottonian age, to historiographical production. They were essentially calling up new scholars and making them elaborating new political theories about the empire, about the legitimization. It was very important because that was the moment in which, in fact, imperial ideology was formally, it was actually formulated as such in a, with defined, characters. In the Carolingian times had been very different, had been mostly based on the political practice rather than political theory. Now, the Ottonians were essentially structuring the second, pretty much. Widukind of Corvey, or Widukind, as you want to call it, was this Saxon chronicler, actually of unknown origin, that entered, however, into the in 941 in the monastery of Corvey. Initially, he wrote certain lives of the saints that are not preserved today. We still don't even know when he actually died, and also we don't know how he entered first in contact with the Ottonians. The only thing we know is that he survived the Emperor Otto I, because he wrote about him after his demise, and he's mostly famous for the redaction of the Rerum Gestarum Saxonicarum Libri 3. So it would be essentially the history of the Saxons. It would be the deeds of the Saxon. It's things of these Saxon deeds, or better, the 3 books of the things of the Saxon deeds, something like that. And this was written around 957, 958. This work is important because in the first book you see that there is a rather imaginative but nevertheless interesting legendary prehistory of the Saxon stock, fundamentally, as well as the age of Henry I. The second book instead contains the history of Otto I up to 946. That was the death of the year of the death of his first wife Editha. And the third book originally arrived only up to the year 958. And in 968, Widukind started to work at a new edition. It was dedicated to the famous daughter of Otto, Mathilde, that was a badass of Quedlinburg, and she, I'd say this ediction was eventually prolonged with other chapters up to the death of Otto I. And this work is very important because it's the first product of Saxon historiography. It's a first-hand source in many ways, and it does stress this kind of Saxon pride fundamentally. The idea that the Ottonian dynasty was objectively a Saxon dynasty, so there was a lot of pride still based on, as we were saying before, on the base of the ethnic duchy still, and it actually doesn't talk much, in fact, not even about Germany much in itself. It mostly talks about Saxony, but the Pope, interestingly enough, is mentioned just once, and even incidentally. Widukind didn't know anything about Italy, or almost practically so. However, what is so this tells us so much, but what is very remarkable is that it's actually written in a decent Latin. So this is a consequence mostly of the high level of scholastic tradition that the Carolingians had set even into these areas, so that a Saxon writer this time could, a Saxon monk could write a good Latin, even if up to a few generations before, no Saxon had actually understood much of Latin, or at least in relative terms. Of course, there were Saxons who knew Latin, but generally speaking, the people had remained largely. They were actually illiterate in many ways, so still. And he uses Sallustius and Livy sometimes, that are but everything, the whole picture is not particularly clear. Even from a political point of view, sometimes you don't really understand. We have difficulties to actually understand much of what is written when contextualized in the Germany of the time. So it was naturally a propaganda work, and that's how all works were at the time. There was nothing like a free thinker or a free writer at the time. But it's nevertheless important because it already gives you this first attempt from a Saxon dynasty to talk about itself and to remark fundamentally its political and importance, and looking at the history of the Ottonians into a historical perspective that naturally had also to overlap on the one of the empire now that was being revived. In any case, the efficacy of the political action of Henry I was not indifferent, if it is that Otto was remembered by German historiography as Otto the Great, managed to be elected in turn as King of Germany. Otto owed a lot to his father, just like other sovereigns that were to rise to a very high level into the Holy Roman Empire. Just think about even Frederick Barbarossa, because of essentially of all the territorial, very intensely the structuring of the territorial power that his father had done. His father built a lot of castles, for instance, had expanded physically in arms the influence of the dynasty. The power had this power had to be grounded in some way. As we have seen, it was impossible to control directly the whole Germany, but at least within the family domains, a strong infrastructure could be built by expanding, by fighting, by risking. So everything that was not really to be given for granted, but a very solid power of castles at this time, based on castles, for instance, was a really big thing, and it could serve as the base to extend his own power. So the Ottonians, as we have seen, were quite fortunate indirectly because of the of the Hungary invasions that put all the German dukes to say, okay, you are the strongest guys there in Saxony, we put you in command of the army. And this naturally was used by the Ottonians to aggrandize their power, also to abuse of it partially, but still in a world where everybody was abusing of it, the neighbors, so fundamentally doing what was normal in the political and military practice of the time. And it was, however, definitely Otto the First, and that also thanks to the length of his kingdom that lasted from 936 to 973, that strengthened in a decisive way royal authority and kind of managed to give a new significance to the imperial title. He obtained these objectives. He achieved these objectives basically by acting in an extremely conscious way since his royal crowning that happened in Aachen. This as a first step was very important, because definitely being crowned in Aachen meant to put Otto in continuity with the Carolingian tradition, and it's very important. The political confidence and awareness is very important in many ways. It's not really something you have to underestimate. Otto definitely rebuilt the concept of empire for the benefit of a greater control over the kingdom of Germany by his dynasty. So this would be used in continuity also by other dynasties, but nevertheless that was his objective, initially speaking. It was very contingental in many ways. That's the reason why he's conceived as the founder of the Holy Roman Empire sometimes, and saying, yeah, because since he was crowned emperor in Rome in 962, the Holy Roman Empire was founded. It's not really like this. The empire had technically never ceased to exist. Also, the term Holy Roman Empire didn't appear, if not, but centuries after Otto's death. He also followed his father in securing the eastern borders and expanding them. He exercised, naturally, famously, his force over Italy and the Papacy. He also cooperated with the Papacy for the Christianization, for instance, chiefly of the Slavic peoples that were still largely pagan. So naturally, now we don't have time to tell the history of Otto I, because we've kind of done it in part other times. This is not the point. I didn't intend, naturally. I stress now the importance of figures like Arnulfo of Carinthia, Louis the Younger, Conrad I, Henry I, because these are it's important to look at the continuity, in my opinion, between the Carolingians and the Ottonians as a bridge, fundamentally. So now we will discuss about about Otto I in other occasions. Naturally, yeah, of course, we have to tell something about him in general, how he contributed to the system. But the details of the life maybe not, as you know, from a symbolical point of view, Otto I was trying to present himself as the true heir of Charlemagne. But naturally, the times of Charlemagne were far at that point, and the political practice had necessarily to be different. So Otto was pretty innovative under this point of view. He tried to establish new ties with the greats of the kingdom, whether they were laymen or clergymen. So he, according to, for instance, to Keller and other historians, it's exactly the system that has been created by Otto I and not the Carolingian one that was rooted on, at least it was imitating ancient models that eventually would determine the balance of the following political balances of the following centuries. This is important because what we were saying before, essentially that the Carolingian Empire had kind of vanished in many ways. It had left a big legacy without which not even the Ottonian Empire would have been possible. But it's indeed true that the Renovatio Imperii passed through the House of Saxony, and the reformulation of the imperial ideology on this new basis. As we have said, also Otto had to cope with this institutional reality of the Eastern Frankish kingdom that was devoid of an administrative net that could control essentially the peripheral areas of the kingdom from its center, whatever the center was at that point in Saxony, and part in Franconia. The counts, the dukes, and all the other seigneurial, the other territorial lords at this point had grown almost independent. Were not the old Carolingian functionaries representative of the royal power, but they basically exercised autonomously their own sovereignty. So how to achieve this goal of controlling the kingdom, where the kingdom is literally made up by these it's literally composed of all these dynasts that don't want to give up their power. We have discussed about the importance of the church in the Ottonian politics. Was definitely very meaningful. I made a video that is called The Ottonians and the Kingdom of Italy that takes into consideration this aspect. Actually, even if in the title it's not expressed, this was fundamentally for Ottonian policy, especially I think in the Italian peninsula. That was actually a remarkable accomplishment and was achieved only thanks to the allegiance of the local clergy, also because the Ottonians didn't have the fact of the ability to control even in there. They didn't control even the whole Germany. Naturally, you can imagine what the difficulties to rule over a land across the Alps with the communications of the times and so on. But they achieved that, politically speaking, even before them militarily, because resources are finite, so you have to deal in some other way. So there is, in the Ottonian times, the creation of what would have continued also in the following centuries, of the so-called system of the imperial church. So many people, and I don't know how he presented it to you in those other videos, but I think I stayed objective, because sometimes the narrative is now, oh yeah, the clergy was so glad to help the king and they were so tied to him. But the reason is that the high clergy at this point was not substantially different from the rest of the nobility. Practically they were the same people, but were certain dynamics naturally in the management of ecclesiastical properties that was different relatively different compared to the lay properties. So for instance, there was a greater continuity in the existence of those properties, because the ecclesiastical property was not split up, for instance, at every generation. Also, figures like bishops and abbots were kind of appointable. They were not hereditary goods. That could, the dioceses and abbeys and were not an hereditary property. So you could theoretically appoint whoever you if you had the power to impose it, you could came to manage more easily an ecclesiastical property than a personal one that was absolutely untouchable by certain standards, because the local families would say, this is my private land now. Not even the king cannot do that, they cannot touch it. And this was very important, because setting a precedent, like confiscating some private land, would cause an enormous unrest into the kingdom, because it said, this is against our prerogatives, our traditions, our customs. It was very hypocritical, because naturally all of these noblemen had kind of stolen their lands for someone else. Firstly, from public power. Secondly, like expanding fact into other people's land, or using their political preeminence to put pressure on people to give them power and so on. So it was perfectly normal, but nevertheless, from the royal perspective, this was a very difficult problem to solve. So the reason why the clergy in part sided with the Ottonians, even when they were not actually protégés, were installed into certain important ecclesiastical offices, is that, as Althoff said, basically that because they could have draw a great profit from their condition and from the loyalty towards the sovereign. It's something you don't have to give for granted. Having, public authority was weak, as we've seen, but nevertheless, obtaining a royal diploma, let's say, that told you that you owned certain prerogatives that were given to you and to your descendants. This is valid also for the laymen, and not just for the lay powers, not just for the ecclesiastical ones, but was kind of important. So the aristocracy naturally didn't, whether it was lay or ecclesiastical, didn't actually like much royal authority. But hey, if the king was supporting you, why not taking that opportunity at mutual benefit? Because at that point the king, as we've seen, was just another dynasty. So everybody had the dynasty was friend and the dynasty was enemy at all times. The king, once he was elected, so recognized officially, publicly, also had this legislative prerogative that could, grant you certain rights, certain privileges and stuff like that. So why not exploiting it? And the church was, the most favored by the monarchy because of the reasons we have explained, and therefore over the centuries tendentially the church sided with the monarchy, and generally speaking with the institution that it represented, to the order that it represented, because these clergymen were highly benefiting from it. So they were quite upset when a king was weak, because this meant that maybe certain lay noble would take this, exploit the situation of anarchy, or it followed sometimes after that a king died, or another one had to be elected. Always remember this. In other countries the king generally only followed. It could be a minor, for instance, and causing problems from this point of view, but there was a lineage, a dynasty. In Germany there wasn't. So you had to put all the electors together to decide who had to rule, and usually they in fact chose rather weak sovereigns. Then some turned out to be good surprises. Other times they had to choose, valid kings, because there were times of trouble. So it's also meaningful that the Ottonians into this 10th century, where the imperial institution was still very weak, they managed actually to create a dynasty that lasted for, Henry the First, Otto the First, Otto the Second, Otto the Third, and also Henry the Second. Even though Henry the Second belonged to the Bavarian branch of the Ottonians that had actually fought against the main branch. But just for saying that, it's important, and this is valid also for other areas of Europe, that in this moment of greater mass, actually something was managed to be rebuilt. And it's not a few. Because naturally we can interpret history just from a kind of opportunistic perspective, like everybody want to, just do what the hell they want. It's not really like that. I mean, sometimes you need an order. You need an authority. You need a commonality. You need a society that holds in some way, because you can't do otherwise. There can't be order. Even if it's like with the Hunger raids into Germany are the best example. Nobody of these German nobles like each other much. They consider themselves so different, even in language sometimes, in custom. Just imagine what a Carinthian could have in common with a Frisian. I don't know. A very few. Even in the high and late Middle Ages, I don't know, Northern Germans and Southern Germans didn't like each other particularly much. But hey, the Hungars are arriving. These are they're not even Christian. They come from, we don't even know where practically. They just settled at the borders of the empire. They launched these raids. What do we do? As we said, many noblemen Germans played one against the other in this context, but overall the whole system was being weakened. So that's why you need some order. You need someone who, at that point is preferable, even if you give more power to the monarchy. That's something you don't really hope for, but that's still more convenient than just having to take care of your own, your own property by yourself. It is less effective. This is also very important to remember, is that divided power is inherently weaker than the sum of all its elements. So it's much easier for an invader, if someone attacks you, to knock out the same exact force when it's scattered than when it's concentrated. And the whole strategy at the time functioned like this. And the Ottonian wars against the Hungars are fundamentally this follow substantially this trend. But we will talk about these wars maybe on another occasion. So, on the other hand, as I was hinting at before, the distinction between the layman and the clergy was pretty much non-existent. At least it didn't make virtually didn't make much of a difference in political practice, because they were fundamentally they were still aristocrats. So they were part of the same ruling class. There weren't excessive differences, especially in countries like Germany. I would say, other post-Carolingian kingdoms had different ecclesiastical traditions. Into Germany, laymen and clergymen kind of got more mixed up as aristocrats into the political practice. That's also why, notoriously in the High Middle Ages, the German bishops were considered more warlike than the others, because substantially the whole thing had been mixed up since the beginning. These were lands of neo-Christianization. These now were Christians formally, but you can imagine what Germany in the 10th century could really be about in terms of understanding of Christianity. It was just the elites, the clergy fundamentally, that were the depositories of, the rest of the population still lived in kind of a world suspended between different traditions. Think about the Lohengrin. That's a beautiful, setting. It takes part of the time of Henry the Fowler that gives you, it shows you that there's still existence of paganism burning under the ashes. That is obviously dramatized, but it's not so realistic after all. So hence the Otto the First and his successors' power was somehow giving up certain forms of statual power that had existed in Carolingian times, that were already pretty, shaky at the time. Now here was were crumbling, but nevertheless, there was still a common language, a common dialect in many ways. I mean, administration, written laws, the exercise of justice, were all elements were used at the advantage of a mediation capacity among the various groups of powers. So at this point, there wasn't much of an active intervention. There was sometimes preferably just the certification, fundamentally, of a certain power that de facto was recognized and in this sense co-opted into the ruling system. This is how it happened into Germany, this is how it happened into Italy, and how the Ottonians managed formally to control over these areas and beyond, just like, for instance, in Burgundy. Or so this is particularly important because it wasn't much of a matter of extending, materially your own power over someone. It was basically just choosing your allies. That's the situation. You don't have any central power, but you have many peoples who are many contenders that are fighting one against the others. What do? You decide which one to back, and this inherently gives you some power, fundamentally. Then things can go wrong. That's pretty natural. So that's where you have to be smart. But that's how you build some kind of relations net, some sort of clienteles. Yeah, I mean on a broader level, So and it is from the other side this intervention that kind of goes intermittently or pro or against the king. So, for instance, the king at this point stresses his legitimization in his sacral role. This is, for instance, very much revived and relaunched by the Ottonians, that were extremely important, especially at the symbolical communication. Was based on certain formulas and rites taken from the Carolingian tradition, but also and especially by the Byzantine and the Roman imperial one. You can see it even from the seals that the first kings of Germany now look more like warriors fundamentally. So there were even there figures were aimed at showing essentially what this class of warrior freemen could opt for. Then over time there is this progressive abstraction, because at that point nobody the middle classes were vanishing in some ways. The elites were becoming increasingly elite, the other masses of people were becoming increasingly poorer. So at that time it was a matter of mostly presenting in front of the elites with certain characters that had to elevate ideologically the rank, if you want, the nature of the imperial authority. And naturally the Ottonian ties with Constantinople were quite instrumental. the as you know, Otto III was a son of the Byzantine princess Theophanu. This, by the way, brought to naturally the contact between the Ottonian and the Byzantine courts, so also the exchange of literates and so on. So there was partly also some injection of classical education at the Ottonian court through these relations. You can imagine the Ottonians were actually pretty, especially Otto I was quite of an ignorant person. After all, I mean, his brother, generally speaking, that was normal. Okay, if you were meant to be a warrior like Otto I actually was, spending all your life on horseback, it's not that you need really to know how to write or read in Latin and so on. But it was rather the clergy now that the Ottonians also placed their family members in some of the highest appointments of the clergy. Think about Bruno of Cologne. That also wrote very interesting. But that was in fact a career. If you were an ecclesiastical, if you were a clergyman, okay, you were educated. If you weren't, you weren't. And that's also why the clergy was so important, because in structuring this ideological, this new political theory, the ideology of the empire, you needed someone who knew how to read at the classical sources to see what the Roman Empire had been and what the meaning of empire had been. So this is why also the church was so instrumental for the Ottonian propaganda. So, as many great ruling dynasties, the Ottonians managed to rise to power, to consolidate their authority through political pragmatism and also sacral representation of the royal power. That's how the Renovatio Imperii actually occurred, and how Otto also was justifying his fight over the Italic crown. That was the key for of access to the Roman imperial crowning. This is something that had been set practically since Carolingian times, so that's why the Teutonic Kingdom was eventually the one. There were several reasons for this. Actually, Italy was rich and divided, so what a best choice for expanding your power. But it had been ideologically connected to the crown. Possibly also because of this. I mean, theoretically, the Teutonic Kingdom was part of, comprehended Rome, in spite of the autonomy that the popes had been enjoying, also thanks to Carolingian aid into central Italy. But formally, they were within their boundary, within the kingdom's boundary. So that's why the German emperors were required the imperial crown, the Italic crown, in order to be crowned emperors, because if you were not king of Italy, you were not controlling the papacy fundamentally, more ideologically than de facto. That this is important. This is important because also the papacy naturally was doing everything to say, okay, well, but I don't recognize you like an emperor unless you come here and you prove me you can take care of me, despite always trying to, it was more like a provocation and anything, because from Germany ruling down to Rome, it's not a very easy task, especially in this time from a logistical point of view, but mostly from a political point of view, because the German nobility, for instance, has been largely, historically speaking, has been largely uninterested in the Italian journeys and the Italian campaigns of the kings, of the German kings. They didn't care. We're just trying to build their own domains into Germany. It was just the emperors now that had this broader universal ambition. And that's why, in fact, most German emperors didn't even like much to be in Germany. They preferred to control Italy because they realized, by the way, that by controlling the Italian peninsula at the time, they would have a power that in Germany they couldn't have, because Italy was relatively more, it was relatively easier to control locally if you had managed to shift the center in there. The problem was shifting the center in there, because there were other competitors for the Italian peninsula, especially at this time the Byzantines, the Saracens, but the same Italic nobility was not very happy of. That's why the church of Italy, the bishops, were so instrumental into the Ottonian power. But the idea is that theoretically these emperors were looking at the empire, something that had been restored from Rome. I mean, the Ottonians, the Swabians, what they wanted, they wanted to rule from Rome. I mean, Germany had to be legitimately just a peripheral region of the empire. The Italian peninsula represented really the golden apple. They wanted to control it. That's why Otto III ruled from Rome with so many difficulties, because the Roman nobility absolutely didn't want the idea of being having an emperor as next door neighbor. So it was very dramatic and problematic. But anyway, there was this intention, and through certain channels also the viability of such an option. Eventually, Germany lost its national monarchy for running after this Mediterranean dream, fundamentally. But this is still very significant because it shows you that it could be done, and objectively the German emperors came pretty close to make it. There is this defeatist attitude for which no, it was just a dream. This is what, by the way, in the 19th century was stressed, because they thought that dynasties like the one of the Swabians were just dreamers, were lost in a kind of a hubris to go there and to becoming Roman emperors and forgetting about Germany. But if you look at in objective terms, if everybody did it, there was a legitimate reason, and definitely seizing Italy was a very profitable option. That's not surprising that these people did. That's kind of important to remember. Usually such big political and military decisions do not come like, just, I don't know, one German emperor waking up one day and saying, okay, let's go conquer Italy. It didn't happen like that. There were long roots, deep roots and long lasting connections between the Germanic and the Teutonic Kingdom. There was a continuity that could not be ignored. Other countries of Europe were gravitating around other systems. Spain was relatively well confined in its geographical boundaries. Eventually, the northern France and England got engulfed in each other's events. Eastern Europe also was pretty much intertwined. The Alps didn't function much as a barrier, but rather as a communication channel between these areas of Central Europe that remained since for a very long time, actually during the modern age, as inescapably intertwined in terms of relations, as a relation that is very fascinating in many ways, also because Germany and Italy were and are very different countries, so this continuous interaction is still very, very fascinating. It's a sort of deadly attraction in many ways, one towards the other. So it's how did Otto actually enter Italy? Well, if you know the story, basically he was called by, I discussed it in that video that I mentioned to you before, the Ottonians in the Kingdom of Italy, so if you're interested about that, that's the right video for you. He was called into the Italian peninsula by the substainers of Adelaide, who was the widow of King Lothar and had been imprisoned by Berengar II, and basically Otto came with his army into Italy. He managed to subjugate the Italic sovereign Berengar and to free and marry the same Adelaide. So the perspective is interesting also because Berengar was not fully subjugated. You know, that was always this problem of fully controlling the Italic vassals. But nevertheless, the Berengar recognized now, I think, also the legacy of Adelaide as was stressing the fact that she was the heiress of the Italic kingdom because of his deceased husband inheritance. So this allowed Otto to exploit the quarrel and to, by marrying Adelaide, to seize the Italic crown for himself as Adelaide's new husband. This happened in 961, and he was finally crowned emperor in Rome in 962. You know that the Iter was, at least in the full full development of the Holy Roman Imperial institution, was during the High Middle Ages, that you, in order to be elected emperor, you had first of all to be elected king of Germany. That happened usually somewhere in Germany, like in Frankfurt or in Mainz, depend really. Then king of the Romans, that was in Aachen. So stressing also in here this tradition, the Carolingian and Ottonian times has been said. King of the Romans meant essentially that you were already kind of an emperor, but or emperor in spe fundamentally, and you had just to be called by the Papacy to go there and to prove that you had reached kind of an extra step, more than just being king of Germany. Because theoretically also other kings of the Christianity could become emperors. There was so you needed this further step fundamentally, saying, okay, in Aachen, the former capital founded by Charlemagne, I'm crowned. So Aachen, naturally, in this context, was still a German land. So fundamentally, usually the election to the kingship of Germany and the kingship of the Romans occurred like in a few time, fundamentally. So they were the same electors, German electors, who controlled it. Then you had to be crowned, in fact, Italic king, which usually happened in Monza or Pavia or Milan. It depends. So this area that corresponded roughly to the ancient center of the Lombard Kingdom and of the center of the Carolingian Kingdom of Italy as well, where there was the famous Iron Crown that said, okay, now you got the crown of Italy. That is not a crown like all the others, because within Italy you have the Papacy as well. So only at that point, and it usually happened in the same occasion, usually, not always, you went, given that these Germans had come to Italy, so now, it was a very complicated thing, as I told you, to organize an expedition in there. So usually that happened in sequence. Once they arrived to northern Italy to be crowned, and you went down to Rome, and you were hopefully crowned by the Pope as Holy Roman Emperor, in fact. So this was all the Iter. Then things started evolving roughly in a different way towards the 14th century, and things that were dealt once again. But at this time in the High Middle Ages, that this was practically the process. And besides Italy, Otto I acted also on other fronts. As we've said before, he managed to defeat on the river Lech in Bavaria the Hungars in 955. and this victory was overly emphasized by the Ottonian propaganda, because eventually, basically, the Hungars really stopped at that point to harass Germany. They were confined now in Hungary, and in a few generations they would also finally Christianize into, on the German model, the Battle of the Lech, and the previous defeats that they had suffered, that the Hungars suffered at the hands of the Germans, brought Hungary to basically look at Germany as the main source of model of power, because that Hungary actually continued to be pretty much influenced by the Byzantine Empire as well. Hungary was a bit between the two. Even if you look at material culture, the Hungarians were pretty much still in the Byzantine orbit at that time, but they still preferred to stick essentially to the Holy Roman Empire, probably because they didn't enter into the Holy Roman Empire, unlike the Bohemians, for instance. But they fundamentally, probably they realized that also the empire was kind of more of a fluid thing. They realized that maybe they didn't risk excessively, although there were pretty intense wars between the Hungarians, the Holy Roman Empire, also with Bohemia, with Poland. It was a pretty complicated situation there, especially this area of Lower Austria and what would be today's Slovakia and southern Czech Republic were the theaters of many also campaigns, sometimes even in the same places, like especially around the Taya River or the Morava River. So these are, the Danube naturally. So these were areas of frontier, had been like since ever practically. Usually from one side there had been the Avars, and then the Magyars, that were the Hungars. From the other side, the Germans, that created this mark over there. Then there were the Slavs in Bohemia. So it's a beautiful place, by the way. If you ever go, naturalistically speaking, it's one of the most beautiful places in Europe that I've ever visited. It's so peaceful, so beautiful. But it was the theater of, it was relatively also depopulated. This region in Austria, fundamentally north of the Danube, that you understand, that you understand that in the south there had been the Roman Empire, in the north, not. But it's really a magic place in many ways, where all these this German, Slav, and Hungarian at that point cultures kind of met and even contrasted naturally. Yeah, and that was important. Naturally, also this was a major international settling in many ways. The Ottonians also interacted with the other Western Slavs and with Denmark. They had relations naturally also with the Western Frankish Kingdom, and they were objectively, in Latin Germanic Europe, they were the strongest power at the time. Where also, if you take the map of Europe, they were probably in the center of Europe, so they had all these other populations around that they had to interact with in one way or another, and they were looking at them also quite worriedly. If I'm not wrong, it's in this Ottonian times that Denmark Christianizes itself because they feared the Ottonian expansionism. So saying, okay, we're Christian now, just think about it twice before attacking us. Also very important were the relations with Poland. It's in 966 that Mieszko the First gets is baptized. This time I made a video that can be interesting about Pope Sylvester the First, that interacted heavily with the Ottonian dynasty and had during the time this broader project of ecclesiastical organization all over Europe. It deeply contributed to the evangelization of also of the Slavs, of the Hungarians, etc. And they, it was all in conjunction with the Ottonian Empire. Although in the church already something was slowly evolving towards the direction of what in the following centuries would have been known as the Gregorian reforms. So, but this is important, in fact. It's the asset that Otto managed to give to Europe at this point, that with all the difficulties, with all the approximations, all the weaknesses of the faults of the system, however, kind of gave that direction. Sometimes you don't even need to actually keep forcing one thing to go into a certain direction. It just take, it's very physical to give them a poke, and that thing already takes a different direction. Well, that's what the Ottonians gave in many ways. If you look at the symbols of Ottonian power, you realize it's mostly there that the Carolingian and Roman and Byzantine influence occurred. The symbols of power, like the dress, this scepter, the crown, the court ceremonials, all elements that were stressing the bond between the ideas of regnum et sacerdotium, fundamentally, that were united in the figure of the emperor. This also was very, very meaningful, given the relation, in fact, that the Ottonian power had with the clergy. The Ottonians were progressively trying to become, on the Byzantine model, by the way, the leaders of the church. The idea that the Pope was fundamentally dictating what the emperors had to do is something that starts occurring very late, and it's paradoxically exactly the Ottonian interference in the church and an attempt of reformation, which often equated to just appointing, favorite bishops and abbots in the main centers of church power. That this is that triggered eventually the Gregorian reform, and the idea of purification of the church, the idea of reformation. I made some videos about that. If you go in medieval Christianity playlist, you find it's plenty of them at the roots of the Gregorian reform or something like that. It was, I don't remember, medieval Christianity, let me see. Should be one. These playlists are becoming very hefty. One is the Roman Church and Schwerpunkt that talks about Ottonian times under this point of view as well. But, before the Gregorian reforms, Cluny, Hermitage and Pataria. Those are kind of interesting. They don't talk specifically about Ottonians, but there are some parts of that into the thing. Yeah, that's more or less it. Then the others are mostly, the other informations are mostly in the Ottonian playlist. Instrumental to this new imperial idea, this ideal of imperial sacralization, had been the rite of the holy anointing, thanks to which the emperor now was growing as much more than a simple king. He was had a touch of holiness, basically. He was being the protector of Christianity and of the Church of Rome. This is important also at another level that is maybe overlooked, that is how the fact that in the Germanic world, and I mean the pagan one, the idea of the holy anointing was not really unknown. Even the same early Carolingians and other Germanic kings had this idea that basically they had to stress their own royal prerogatives as holy rulers, as someone who had a divine touch. This had been a recurrent struggle within the Germanic populations because of the same reasons that basically the Ottonians were using, especially in Germany. That is, okay, I don't have enough power, because in this Germanic society, most likely, there is an aversion towards the centralization of power. So what do I do? I stress the fact that I'm of divine origin. This is something you find even during the migration era, to cope essentially with this lack of centralization that was being stressed. Naturally, we're not, this is not very clear. We can grasp it from certain mythical origins of the, certain books on the mythical origins of the various Germanic peoples. It's something we can't see much better when the Germans settled down into the Roman lands where there was already the church, and therefore we can observe the interaction between the two things. In the Carolingian imperial tradition, this had been quite evident, because even since Merovingian times, the Franks had stressed pretty much the allegiance between the kings and the clergy, and stressed this idea of sanctification through the holy anointing and so on. So it wasn't just a matter of a purely Christian tradition. There was something added to that also was inherent to the struggle between the elites and the freemen within the Germanic world. So it was something naturally very artificial, as you can imagine, because it was emerging exactly as a reaction of the impossibility among the Germanic freemen to claim that one freeman was superior to another, was freer to another, to quote Orwell. But these are also the means you can do. Naturally, in Ottonian times, this was much easier to do, because there was already a society that was relatively stratified. We've seen it with the elites. We've seen it with now the Christianization, the formal Christianization of these lands, the introduction of an ecclesiastical hierarchy that naturally had also its own ideologies relative to the holiness of the institutions, primarily of the church, naturally, but also kind of backing and supporting imperial authority for the reasons that we have seen. Very important in the Ottonian politics is the so-called privilegium Ottonis, that is Otto's privilege, literally, which was practically we told it other times, but an act was promulgated in Rome, not surprisingly, on February the 13th, 962. So just after that, Otto had been crowned emperor, and this document seems authentical. It's still, it's probably, we have the copy of the original. It's a very old document. It should be in the Vatican secret archive, and it basically, what about the contents? Basically, the Papacy and Otto, so Pope was John the 12th, if I'm not wrong, and Otto were confirming the validity of the Constitutio Romana of Lothar the First, was Carolingian Kingdom of Italy back in the day, dated to 824, and at this point, the connection was that the papal election had to receive the consent of the Holy Roman Emperor, or of his representatives. So basically, through this privilegium, Otto was attributing to himself some real rights of surveillance, even military ones, on the city of Rome. And Otto was, in exchange, recognizing the donations that Pippin the Short had made back in 754, the so-called Promissio Carisiaca. Basically, this was done over the certain territories that had to belong to the Pope, practically in central Italy, that naturally were supporting the papacy. And to basically the Constitutio Romana, emanated by Louis the Pius in 824. I said Lothar the First, but now, excuse me, I have some problems now with the basically was stressing, however, the concept, the principle that in at the beginning had always been really not followed, that the Pope, once was elected by the clergy of the people of Rome, had to swear an oath of allegiance to the emperor. So this was a problem, because ever since the beginning this relation between the papacy and the empire had been extremely ambiguous. There had been certain practices like the Roman crowning that had kind of survived, had been pretty clearly defined, and fundamentally the German kings accepted the fact they had to become kings of Italy, but it was also, they were kind of obliged to do so, because objectively they couldn't impose themselves on the papacy if not through controlling Rome de facto, because the papacy at the time was controlled by the Roman aristocracy, so there was no way you could decide one thing without going there in arms. In fact, the Privilegium Ottonis stressed also the military control on the city of Rome. That was fundamental to carry out certain influences, practically. And by the way, the promises that Pippin the Short had made to the papacy were kind of pretty much fantastic in theory, because the papacy had asked originally the control over basically the whole, like I think the whole Italy, like just parts of the Po Valley were left out, but basically he wanted everything from like the Po mouth or the Adige mouth to the Strait of Messina. So basically the Pope had asked in Carolingian times to become a ruler of almost the entire Italian peninsula, in virtue of the ancient metropolitic repartition. The papacy controlled basically the archdioceses of of Italy as a whole. It had this private name. I should look into detail, because there were also other archbishops into Italy. So, but let's say that the papacy was building this influence that saw Italy as this natural route, way of expansion, and it was not objectively that strange if it hadn't been for the fact that the papacy didn't have at all any power at that time. I mean, literally at the mid of the 8th century was only at that time very timidly managing to expand from Rome towards the Apennines and kind of getting certain power in there, because de facto the papacy didn't have this huge territorial domination. I mean, it had it in the sense that the city of Rome was pretty rich and extremely fertile, also in the countryside, and everything virtually belonged to the church there legally. That's very particular. It has it's something you find only in certain Byzantine territories, practically. So the power was indeed enormous, as even greater were the international relations that Rome had sown with the major powers of the time. So that they had, in spite of being a small territorial power, it had an enormous political influence all over the continent. But the problem is that obviously this land was, you know, the Franks even granted it, I think, in theory at one point. They say, okay, well, this was always very ambiguous, but that's really the point, is that the popes wanted to leave the emperors out from Italy, theoretically. They were obviously very supportive of the Carolingians, as we know, like in that case, but they were, because they fundamentally were just that they knew that also the imperial power wasn't enormous at that point. The context that brought to that has been discussed in other videos. Now we don't repeat it, but you have an idea, and it was recognized, however, by the papacy that whoever ruled across the Alps had substantial difficulties at managing what was happening to the peninsula. So the papacy was extremely thrilled by this, because they knew that they could progressively expand in this vacuum that was dispensed by the between the Carolingian, the Germanic Empire and the Byzantine one, where they could theoretically do whatever they wanted. So what happened in the Ottonian times is that, once again, actually for the first time in many ways, the Ottonians managed to settle into Rome proper. It's very difficult. They don't make it. They have plenty of enemies. They have plenty of problems. The Ottonians had to deal with the Saracens, with the Byzantines, with the German nobility. It was a mess. With Italic vassals, it was really a mess. But nevertheless, they had achieved it in part. I mean, in terms of the control on Rome. It is amazing, considering it happened in the 10th century. So this naturally was happening because the empire and the church were kind of looking at each other's backs, and at the same time being always ready to stab each other in the back, because they were ultimately, and this is the point, I guess, that the political convenience can create very strange partners, and naturally these were the two universal powers, so they had some kind of responsibility overall, and if they wanted to achieve what they wanted to achieve, they needed each other necessarily. So there was, however, this lingering conflictuality between the empire and the church that during the Ottonian times didn't arrive to manifest, chiefly because of the papal weakness. It was a consequence of the crisis that Rome had lived in post-Carolingian times, when the exponents of the Roman aristocracy for several years had competed for the papal office, and that had entrusted the title to characters that were actually of relatively, well, decisively of low moral profile. So this explains, I think, well, what the main differences between the Carolingian and the Ottonian empires really were. So when also, this is the general rule, when you hear Holy Roman Empire, foundation of the Holy Roman Empire in Ottonian times, always turn the other way, because that's a kind of a inaccurate, historically inaccurate definition. There was nothing like a Holy Roman Empire in 962 that was founded. You have to look beyond that. You have to say, okay, what did really happen at that point. Surely not, the Holy Roman Empire was not founded, because it wasn't called like that, and if there was an empire, that was the direct continuation of the Carolingian one. There was no discontinuity, practically. So I would say that, however, these main transformations are kind of important to stress. They are very meaningful, especially for those times, and therefore all the criticism that can derive from, there is this mockery, general mockery of the Holy Roman Empire. Something was nor holy nor Roman nor an empire. Is I think it was Voltaire or Montesquieu, I don't remember. It was criticizing the in the 18th century what the Holy Roman Empire was at the time. But so it was a general criticism at the time, also towards the Middle Ages, as this moment of alleged obscurity, of darkness, of oppression, and something like that. But obviously this is not true. But that also has to be contextualized and understood in that context. But look at, in fact, what this Saxon dynasty really managed to achieve into his times, to these troubled times. These were really, the same, say, barbarians that were defeated by the Carolingians back in the day. And now they were the ones who restored the empire. So it's a big word, indeed. As I said, even at the beginning of the video, talking about empire for the Ottonian one is really problematic. It's not easy. It's often, I don't know how you define an empire in terms of size and scales and in effectiveness, because that's actually very difficult to do. But the empire is, in theory, someone who has an army that is managed to use to control that uses to control a wide area over which the empire extends. I don't know, it's a very approximate definition of empire, also given that there are so many ideological ideas attached to it. But I guess the main point in here is that the Ottonians still managed, in spite of that, of this problem, of this difficulty in control, to do something like objectively tying for centuries the crowns of Germany and the crowns of Germany and Italy, and of controlling partly the Italic and the German church and the Papacy in itself, to settle in Rome, to wage war into southern Italy, to expand, to secure the borders, to stop the hunger raids, to consolidate the frontiers of Germany on the Slavic border, to kind of give an internal asset to Germany that, despite naturally spoiled by this structural weakness limits, was nevertheless somewhat functioning. Because somewhat, this was an elective system, but you have a dynasty like the Ottonian one that ruled practically for 1 century in dynastic line. So it means that something was working, whatever it was, whatever its political equilibrium, whether it's just a set of favorable circumstances, but it took a big effort to achieve. And it ultimately came to structure what would remain the Holy Roman Empire. This is very interesting. There was no real continuity, in fact, between the Holy Roman Empire and the Carolingian Empire from an institutional point of view. The Carolingians had very different. There is obviously a continuity, but in the idea of the empire, in the title, in the relations with the papacy, and so on. But it was still something very. The Carolingian Empire was relatively, it didn't last. At the end, it collapsed. I mean, before the rise of the Ottonians, what was the empire then? I mean, in terms of, I'm talking de facto, in terms of political unity, of capability of control, there wasn't. The Ottonians reshaped this on narrower basis, because as we were saying, they didn't make it to rebuild the Carolingian Empire, to restore it in its borders. The Carolingian Empire was much bigger. It was a hell of a thing, if you think about it. Stretched from Poland to Spain, from Bretagne to central Italy. I mean, it was something really. It was really a thing. The Ottonian Empire was smaller, but at the same time, it lasted more. I mean, the Holy Roman Empire, whatever it was de facto, was, and this axis between the north and the south, and this expansion also towards the east, was fundamentally set in those moments, and it went on. It went on, and the empire lived basically up to 1806 as an entity that functioned, that had its institutional history, its evolution, and so on. So this was very, very important in its in the essentials, to say, okay, this thing, whatever it was, it lived on, and it wasn't just an educational thing. Like, what's the greatest Carolingian legacy in many ways? It's mostly a political and social transformation, especially in society, integration of the expansion and the strengthening of the vassalitic beneficiary system, the ecclesiastical education, the standardization of writing, and so on. Yeah, it's pretty big, and that's really probably the greatest legacy of the... There is an imperial legacy, of course, also of the Carolingians, but at the same time, most of the job, and this is what I've tried to explain today, was eventually redone by the Saxons, by the Ottonians. This is what the Ottonians maintained. If you want, the concept of the sword into this area that fundamentally was not, if you think about it, was probably not contested by anyone else. I mean, it was really definitely contested as, people tried to fight against these entities, to take over Italy. There were moments in which an imperial crown was also given, but completely formal way, to Spanish or English rulers, like it happened especially after the Hohenstaufen in the mid 13th century. But in fact, the idea that that Germany was kind of a thing on its own, and not properly Germany, but let's say this area of Central Europe that mostly corresponded to this Teutonic Kingdom, and that Italy was dependent from it, and it basically pertained to it. Well, that's something that's never been really altered. Really not. Spain entered into play with the wars of Italy because at that time the Habsburgs were both Holy Roman Emperors and kings of Spain. But also, even if Italy was governed, if you think about the Duchy of Milan chiefly, was governed and by the Spanish at one point, these were still imperial lands. I mean, those were imperial dependencies, and also the other Italian states who were, pretty autonomous there in the center and the north, they kind of remained as vassals of the Holy Roman Empire, and also participated, in fact, pretty actively also in many politicians and generals that they all served. Think about the 30 Years' War that were coming from there, because they were unavoidably tied. Now, it would be interesting also to analyze, strategically speaking, the importance of the rise of certain dynasties, especially in the south of Germany. Like, if you look at it, actually the Ottonians came from the north of Germany, but they managed to tie Italy to that. But probably in the High Middle Ages, it was very important that there were certain dynasties that gravitated more or less in this southwestern area of Germany, initially the Franconians that were, however, roughly in the center west of Germany, but especially the Swabians that had this more evident military intervention into the peninsula and also in the Mediterranean as a whole. And then the Habsburgs, because if the imperial crown had gone to someone else, actually the Habsburgs managed to secure the crown only by the Holy Roman imperial crown only by the 15th century. Before there had been the Bohemians, but even the Bohemians actually, also the Luxembourgs had managed to interfere. And there, of course, the Luxembourgs had other territories scattered in Germany, but they mostly were, the biggest property was the Bohemian Kingdom. So, yeah, you can argue that there was always a tendency to strengthen up the connections with Italy. In the case of Habsburg, that's pretty evident because the Habsburgic lands were even present into the Italian peninsula proper, in part, already during the 14th century. So I would say that it's meaningful, however, that historically northern Germany wasn't really ruled by excessively powerful dynasties that made it to the empire. It was mostly southern Germany. It was the wealthiest one. Also thanks to the contact with with the Italian peninsula. Especially during the 14th century, many of the major Italian trade was shifted from Provence and France in general to Bavaria, for instance. So that's also why certain dynasties started to make a fortune, actually. But yeah, I mean, there are several reasons that would be interesting to observe, maybe in another video. So this is all in for now, and I hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, please share it, otherwise leave a like or subscribe to my channel if you're interested in my upcoming contents. And for now, I thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time and see you next time. Bye.